You are entering the Nillyverse with your hosts Gustavo Candia and Rodney Perry. This episode has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. No.
Well, good morning.
Good morning, Rodney.
And this is a very interesting area. I like this sections. We had just got, last time we talked about how science is, I don't know if you'd call it evolving, I guess evolving into religion light. Mm-hmm. And we found that popularizers of science are in fact making use of faith in a variety of things. They are doing religion, and we didn't need to, as I said, we didn't need to convince them that they're doing religion. They tell us that they are.
Yeah.
And as we're getting into this second part of this little discussion we're having here, we see that they're also quite obviously doing philosophy. And though they will, in general, the pops deny that they're doing philosophy and say that there's a clear boundary between philosophy and science, all you have to do is just look at their books, listen to their lectures and so forth, and you find out that it's not at all the case. Mm-hmm. They are in fact doing philosophy. And I just wanted to introduce a couple things that we did here. I got 3 heuristics that I talk about, and I've used these for my own thinking and writing. They're almost simplistic. They're so simple, but yet they're really helpful when it comes to talking about these boundaries between what people are doing. And the first one is saying that if theology is an attempt to understand the nature of the universe with a God in it, universe includes God and you're thinking about its nature, you're doing theology. If you think about the nature of the universe, but there's no God in your universe, that's philosophy. It's just a simple way of talking about the difference between theology and philosophy. Here's another one. Science, according to its own definitions, science is trying to find out the nature of the universe according to the how question. They're driven by how things work, and that is epitomized, of course, by laws. Philosophy is asking about the nature of the same universe, but they're asking it using the help of the why question. So philosophers ask why, scientists ask how. And here's a third one. If you look at people who write about science, they talk about writers who are just thinking about what science should be. They say that the scientific discovery, if you look at it in the past, has at different times been driven by different things. And that in history, that science has been led by empirical investigations, by testing. Sometimes it's led by mathematics, and sometimes it's led by theory. Now, the way that we look at it today, of course, is that, of course, popularizers of science do not use mathematics in their presentations. They lose their audience, and they are not led by empirical research. They are, in fact, being led by theory. And our notion is that when science is being led by theory, it is indistinguishable from philosophy. So there's just some 3 things to sort of think about. So let's just see what that means in terms of what different popularizers have said. Because popularizers, they speak very openly about this relationship between what science is and what philosophy is and what religion is. They like to talk about these kinds of things. Now, let me just note about Stephen Hawking, for instance. And just to remind everybody, these popularizers of science, epitomized, of course, by Hawking, are very, very influential on how many people are listening to them and the effect that they're having. They're actually determining how the culture sees the world. They're doing that. They have that much power. And just think of, his, for instance, his A Brief History of Time, this classic little book that he wrote. It set the record for best-selling, a number of weeks on the bestseller list in the Sunday Times of London. So when Hawking was speaking, people were listening. It's very, very important to remember that. So with this in mind, he also wrote another book. Actually, it was with a co-author who I think actually wrote the book. But he wrote another book called The Grand Design. And in it, he says that he introduces these questions about where does life come from? Is there a need for a creator and so forth? And then he says this very poignant things. It's become a famous point that he made, his declaration. Traditionally, he says these questions are for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with the modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. He says it straight out. It's not like you and I writing a book have to be very subtle and bringing together all this research from far and wide and over time. He says it very straightforward. Philosophy is dead. Scientists are the new philosophers. Scientists are the one who are physicists. Of course, he is a physicist. Philosophy is the physicists are leading us in our quest for knowledge. When Hawking made this famous observation that philosophy is dead, of course, reminds everybody of Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, God is dead. Gott ist tot. In a certain sense, he was saying was very parallel in what he was saying there. Now, you and I have, when we've been doing our podcasts and so forth, we've sort of decided to just not quite go deeply into our analysis of Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche, because we felt as though the subject needed to be kind of like straightforward. But we will return. We did a long analysis of the writing of Sartre and how his existentialism is shown itself in the Pop's writing. And we did a long analysis of the writings of Nietzsche to show how his Übermensch, the overman, in English it was originally, I think, translated as Superman, which doesn't very well, but anyway. And now that we have Uber, we know what Uber means, so Uberman is okay, Übermensch is okay. But we will return to that.
Yeah, we actually devoted an entire section. The book is comprised of 7 sections, and one section entirely devoted to Nietzsche and Sartre, or existentialism and nihilism in general.
Yeah, that was a good section for me. My training has been in Eastern philosophy, and it was fun to go deeply into the writings of these Western philosophers. So I enjoyed it. And I think we came up with some interesting stuff. So, and you had said that you had been thinking about Nietzsche here lately. And so maybe next time we'll do it before we get into the final section. Okay.
Absolutely. I got something good in my back pocket that I'm
there's a lot to be said there and very interesting.
Yeah.
So just to get back on, so Hawking was making essentially the same, in Nietzsche saying God is dead. Hawking was saying essentially the same thing by saying that philosophy is dead. And one of the things they're saying in that is that, according to Hawking, he's saying philosophers, traditional philosophy, it doesn't have the heuristic value. It can't solve the problems we're looking at anymore. In fact, we physicists are solving those problems. We have usurped the philosophers. So, very interesting area, very interesting area. So that's Hawking. Let's just do a little bit more on Hawking and just remember. So that, to go back to our heuristics now, Hawking is trying to understand the nature of the world without God in it. He says very clearly, I'm an atheist, and without God in it. So that makes him, and he's asking the why question, that makes him the philosopher. So I just want to read something from the Grand Design. And he's looking at the sort of the larger questions of the grand design of the universe. And he says this, and he says it in poem. It's written in verse. He says this: why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Why is this particular set of laws and not others? This is the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. That is the statement of a philosopher.
Right.
He's asking the why question about the nature of the world. Unambiguously taking on the realm as a philosophy. So these are the words of philosophy. Also, I just wanted to point out again, he wrote that as a stanza, as a poem. And what that does is it tells us that there is a poetic nature to the universe. And he is using poesy to try to bring that out. That's another section, another thing that brings up some really interesting notions. So our book goes into 5 or 6 other popularizers of science and showing how they are talking about as philosophers and so forth. So I don't want to go. We won't need to go deeply into that. But I'll just make a couple quick mentions. For instance, Sean Carroll, he's at Caltech. He wrote a book called The Big Picture on the Origins of Life, Meaning, and the Universe Itself. Doesn't that sound like a scriptural book? Doesn't that sound like reflecting on
pretty grand?
Very grand title. So you don't even have to look into the book to see that he's asking the philosophical question. The question of meaning is the why question. The philosophical question. Why is the question of meaning? And he puts it right in his title, so we don't have to go seeking around a lot about what he's trying to do. So here's a statement from him. Life is not a substance like water or a rock. It's a process like fire or a wave crashing on the shore. It's a process that begins, lasts for a while, then ultimately ends. That's a poem. He just wrote a poem. And he's not hiding from that stance toward physics. He, in fact, calls his approach to physics poetic naturalism. He says that there's a poetic nature to the universe. And that's an interesting one. That's a philosophical question. Here's one more. Brian Greene, very popular physicist, you can see him on YouTube. He's a great speaker. Wrote a book called The Elegant Universe. And he talks a lot about what physics should be. When you talk about what physics should be, that's philosophy of science. Yeah. He is being a philosopher of science when you say things like that.
Yeah.
And he says that the traditionalists, now he's not including himself in the traditionalists, but in a kind of a newer genre of scientists. He says that the traditionalists want their theoretical work immediately tied to empirical research, right? That is the notion of you set up a hypothesis and you test it. And he's saying those are the traditionalists. But he's saying in this, the traditionalists, but others think that we are ready to tackle questions that are beyond our present technological ability to test. Oh, he's saying what we're doing in physics now has gone beyond the basic groundwork, the basic foundation of science. We can't test what we're doing anymore. Quite obviously, very important writer, very important university. And as I've mentioned before, if 20 years ago, 30 years ago, physicists had said these in lecture halls, they would have been run out for being subjective.
Yeah.
So let me do one more. Just this famous writer, Alan Lightman. He's most well known for Einstein's Dreams, which is not really a work of physics, but these little vignettes about what Einstein might have been thinking. It's a great book. But he wrote the introduction or the preface to Alan Guth's book about the inflationary universe. And here just says what he says. In the 1970s, cosmologists began seriously asking questions like, why does matter exist at all? Why is the universe as homogeneous as it is? And yet, and then in other words, he says, the nature of the questions have changed. Why was added to the how. He says it straightforward for us. Exactly what our approach and analysis is. He says it straightforwardly, that for the popularizers of science, the question of why has been added to the how. Really interesting to me how overt this usurpation of philosophy is by popularizers of science. What's the conclusion we make here is this, that the popularizers of science, as it's happening right now in our culture, is by its very nature a form of philosophizing. So there's one thing I wanted to ask as we get done, and it's something that we ask in our book, and it says that we sort of wondered, why are popularizers of science taking on these questions? They're taking on a path of exploration that by its very nature expands the boundaries of scientific knowledge. In the book, I use the phrases that they're asking questions that are bigger, faster, and more primordial than their traditional tools are capable of answering. This is the way of nihilology. Nihilology says that it is the pattern of philosophy, religion, and science that lets us have a more deeper understanding of the universe. It lets us answer questions that are, as I say, bigger, faster, and more primordial than the standard traditional science is able to ask. Very good, very straightforward, and we don't have to be kind of subtle or pushing or stretching our analysis. It's really very straightforward that the pops have embraced being philosophers.
We know where the battleground is right now. Was it Carol then that said that the traditional way of seeing science is, the word traditional, right, is a nice way of saying sort of the old way of thinking, right?
The old guys.
Yeah, the old science is this way, the old scientist.
That's right.
But Greene sort of, in a way, right, what he wants is to be untethered by a gold standard. The economic analogy, we don't want to have to hold gold to be able to print dollars anymore. Right. Exactly. Right? What we want to do is printing money is not being tethered by the gold standard, is not having to resort to measurement. Right? We want to be able to say things beyond measurement.
Beyond measurement.
We want to go further than measurement allows. right?
Right.
Even though this is the measurement standard is a good thing. This is universal, and there'll be the new way of thinking would be the new scientific way of thinking would be, yeah, it is good for you guys, right? But let us sort of go into let us go further without acknowledging the fact that it's great for you to go further, but you can no longer have your science cap on. Isn't that fair? Just take off your science cap and just call yourself a philosopher or a theologian. What's wrong or deceiving, right, is for you to be able to wear your cap of science, say what you're doing is science, because you've done science in the past, you've published other scientific literature, but all the while like sort of slipping in your philosophical or even theological views in your writing. So that's what we're trying to expose here with the book. And so I guess what we want to do maybe at this point is kind of recall apophatic theology, and this might help, right, getting us towards neurology, right, and the pattern of thinking. Remember apophatic theology? We had an episode, I don't know, months ago. It was defined as the negative via negativa, or the negative way. When Origena wrote, "We do not know what God is. God Himself does not know what He is because He's not anything." He's literally there. God is not, right, because He transcends being. Origena does not mean that there is no God, but that God cannot be said to exist in the way that creation or the things that we are aware of exist. And in that sense, God is uncreated. He doesn't exist, but that He's uncreated in the sense of how we imagine creation to be. So using apophatic language, we can emphasize what God is other, beyond predication, right, or beyond our. So we can't really point to this as being God. We can work around it in this sense, describe God in what He is not. Okay, that's for apophatic theology. We can learn from human language that the divine nothing is, in neological terms, but not what the divine nothing is. Right. So speaking around nothing can be an effective way of learning about it. And this is essentially like apophatic theology. What we're saying is take that, but let's see if we can create an apophatic science. And then what would that look like? What we need to do then is accept that with an apophatic science, that there are real things that can't possibly be understood by physical means alone. So think of a black hole. This is the best example I could possibly think of. Right? Okay. The thing itself is immeasurable, what it is, right? We have theories about what it is, but we can't see for ourselves what a black hole is in isolation. Instead, scientists depend on seeing the event horizon or looking around a black hole, right? The accretion ring of light before everything disappears. That event horizon itself is not a thing. It's a phenomenon. It's not like there is an actual physical disk or ring around the black hole. It's just all this light that's being sucked into this vortex that is the black hole, or that's how science imagines it currently. It's a phenomenon at the edge of the black hole, helping to define it in space, the black hole in space. So accept that physical descriptions cannot describe. So then go further, right? So we understand that idea. Right? Maybe what we need to do is accept that physical descriptions can't describe things like the soul, the mind, the beyond the universe. Physical descriptions cannot conceptualize these otherwise useful concepts. Okay, so be more humble with the explanatory reach of science. This doesn't mean accepting that there are places where science can never go. Say, like, for instance, oh no, we can't ask about what's beyond the stars. No. You can freely ask any question that you want as a scientist and pursue it, and it would be a good thing to pursue. What we're saying is be more humble, right? That the humility lies in embracing nothing, or the nothing, at the root of all that is. And going back to sort of this idea of awe and insight and outsight, legitimize the reality of the imperience of awe. And remember what awe was, as defined by Rodney here, like a couple of weeks back. When we will ourselves to let go of all definable things and encounter nothing.
Yes.
Accept that as a reality. Whatever, how I know that it's more comforting to think of reality as in terms of real physical things and processes, right? As Carol said, right? That life is not a substance, it's a process, but life is a real thing, right? We accept it because we have common experience of it. So it's not that scientists are just down to reality being just material, but accept there is more, legitimize, there are other realities, right? The reality of something that we have experience of, accept that there's something real there. And that word real is important, right? What you categorize as being real and what you categorize as being unreal. And that I harp on that almost like every week, because I think that's I think the sticking point for scientists, accepting the reality of things beyond the purview of science. So I propose a test for the pops to see if they're ready for apophatic science.
Oh, okay.
So what's the test? Can you, as a popularizer of science, differentiate between a problem and a mystery? To help you, problems are the everyday questions that are posed by scientists for scientists to solve in a professional capacity, where there is clear methodology for how to arrive at solutions. Okay, you follow these steps, you'll come to a conclusion, either yay or nay, or insufficient information. Okay, we need to test further. Those are problems. Mysteries, however, are embraced by individuals where solutions are seldom identified as the goal. But rather, if pushed, you might say that the goal is rather a reframing of one's worldview. By reframing one's worldview, a mystery is considered solved. Right? But only in that way. It's not like that you come to an answer, that you see the world in a different way. So if you can accept such a difference, legitimizing both problems and mysteries, then you're halfway there, right? Exactly. If you accept the reality of both problems and mysteries, you give them a place in what you accept to be real and not real, right? Then you're halfway there.
That's right. Your worldview includes both. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. Talking about in a very interesting way what Marcel did in his book, The Mystery of Being. I think it's very interesting. And then the part that you brought in at the end there is really good, in that what Marcel talks about a lot about this difference between a problem and a mystery. But he says that one of the things, and this is what you just said, that one of the things that differentiates them is that the mystery, in dissolving the mystery, you might say, includes a change of yourself. You are included in the so-called solution.
It changes you, yeah, absolutely.
It changes you, which is really kind of interesting. In a certain sense, he's saying that mystery goes beyond objectivity.
Oh, absolutely. So the problems are objective problems, and you could say that they don't really include the individual. Whereas the mystery, you're an active participant in it, and you're changed as a result of having solved it.
It reminded me, when you're talking about the black hole and the event horizon and so forth, I spend quite a bit of time looking at scientists doing presentations on YouTube. And I'm not sure where I learned this, but a scientist was saying, I think he was referring to another scientist, one scientist referring to another scientist, who said that if I could get anything I want to when I die, I would die on the event horizon and fall into a black hole.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you know that?
There's a friend of Richard Dawkins.
Okay, a friend of Dawkins. It was probably Dawkins himself who didn't want to say it.
Maybe.
I thought that was really interesting that you use the black hole as the scientific equivalent for introducing apophatic notions, that there's something, the light in the black hole can't be seen, and you can just sort of peer over the event horizon.
In a way, for traditional scientists, it's not a thing because you can't measure it directly. If you send light to a black hole, it's not coming back at you, right? And remember, we measured how a measurement is made is by light pinging a thing and coming right back and being measured by the eye or by some measuring device. In this case, for a black hole, the light goes in, it doesn't come back at us.
It doesn't come back.
So what we have to do is we're speaking about it, or it's being defined by that ring around. We're working around the thing itself. in that sense, it's apophatic.
Yeah.
But the other terms are like the mind or beyond the universe. We can't speak about beyond the universe in natural terms. We can speak of them in natural terms, just some metaphors to get a sense of what it means, but we can't speak of it directly or like the way that a scientist would regularly speak about like an electron or whatever,
Right.
some substantial thing. But it's useful to have in our minds an idea about something beyond the universe.
It's useful to have that image or that notion, right? And
Without
the black hole is becoming the sort of heaven of the heaven of the scientists.
It's a fruitful scientific concept that can
is.
bridge the gap between popularist science, or scientism, and theology. Yeah, so maybe what we can do at this moment is go to our Hop on Pop session.
Absolutely.
For this week, we picked a popularizer of science that we've picked on in the past. It's David Albert. He's a physicist, right? But I think he would identify more as a philosopher of science now than as a physicist. And he points out sort of how these two groups are essentially sort of trying to solve different problems, or they're looking in different directions. So you can't really say that one can honestly usurp the other. As say someone like Stephen Hawking says, when Stephen Hawking says philosophy is dead, well, on whose ground is that? Right? So let's see what David Albert has to say.
I have to ask about why so many physicists are bashing philosophers these days. So to give you a few examples, Stephen Hawking in his last book said that philosophy is dead because it hasn't kept up with developments in physics. Lawrence Krauss and Neil deGrasse Tyson, other high-profile physicists, have made very cutting remarks about philosophy, especially philosophy of science. And basically they say this is, just sort of, it's not dealing with the real world. And David, you have been in the middle of this debate. Why is there this tension between philosophy and physics?
I'm not sure I know what to say about that. I mean, there have been instances for a while where philosophers are pointing out to physicists in one way or another that they're not doing their jobs properly. And this is, there was a very long period during the 20th century where if you grew up in a physics education and if you became puzzled about issues at the foundations of quantum mechanics, you were told in very stern language that could have consequences for your future career if you didn't pay heed to it, nowadays we know that physics is not about what the world is like. Physics is about the business of predicting the positions of pointers on measuring instruments and so on and so forth. And if you said something like, okay, so which department should I go to if I want to find out what the world is like? Because I thought that's what physicists were doing. This would be diagnosed as a worrisome sign of intellectual immaturity and so on and so forth. And there was a very long period of people on various edges of physics and philosophers saying, gee, we thought the project here was to tell us in some fairly straightforward, realistically understandable sense what the world is like.
But the criticism that physicists often level against philosophers is contemporary philosophy doesn't add anything to our knowledge of the world. It doesn't add any science to the world. Yeah, you ask some good questions, but you're not contributing to knowledge.
So there are two things to say about that. One thing to say is, and these two things pull in sort of opposite directions. Here's the less interesting thing to say about that is, what the hell kind of a question is that? So what if you ask physicists what they've done for music lately? I don't know. We're doing physics. We're not doing music. This is what we're interested in doing. But there's a more serious thing to say, which is that what's been interesting for many, many years, going back at least to the scientific revolution, is that there has been a boundary between between physics and philosophy, across which they're yelling at each other and accusing each other of things and asking each other very interesting questions, which has been enormously productive. I mean, if everybody now acknowledges, for example, that if it hadn't been for the Machian analysis of the role that time plays in classical mechanics, Einstein never would have come up with the special theory of relativity. Einstein is very much upfront about this in the way he talked about it. And more recently, I think it's fair to say that all sorts of developments that have come very much into the mainstream of physics, like the whole field of quantum computation, for example, was, as a historical matter, a fairly direct spin-off of people, mostly people in the philosophy community or close to the philosophy community, thinking about issues about how to solve the measurement problem. And these issues we were talking about with Everettian interpretations of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there are going to be historical eras where physics defines itself in a certain way, which involves forgetting what its portfolio really is.
And I want to bring Jim into this.
Let's stop there. Of course, if a scientist sort of says philosophy is dead, right, and philosophy hasn't kept up with science, and that's why it's dead, well, the funny way to respond is, of course not, if you're talking along physical lines, right? What has physics done to help the advancement of music, right? And in what way has philosophy aided in the development of music? So you can sort of see it like, but physicists, right, do physics, and philosophers do philosophy. Physicists denigrating philosophy, right? Like they're really saying, what have you produced for us lately? Albert does give us a couple of examples in the history of science where philosophical thinking helps scientists right through mental blocks. So we can't really sort of quantify how much of the special theory of relativity, right, is due to Einstein sort of having been questioning these, or having read Mach's interpretation of time. But you could sort of say that the special theory of relativity would not have seen the light of day had it not been for these questions being floated around in a scientist's mind. Physics has lost its way in that it doesn't try to observe reality. This is something that Albert says, but rather it focuses more on observing dials on measuring devices.
That's right. It's more about measurement. Yeah.
And where should we go if we want to observe reality, or if we want to understand reality? Well, I mean, Albert sort of calls into question, if you're going into science wanting to sort of understand reality, you might be disillusioned. And so if you have those questions in your head and you go into science, the outcome might be that you try to force reality right into this bubble where it isn't, right? It isn't in that bubble. It can't be contained in that bubble. And that's when you start leading to problems, falling into scientism and not seeing the pattern of knowing that we're speaking of here, that one that actually helps you have a better sense of what reality is. But I don't know, what are your thoughts about this video? And
first of all, I like the way that these dressed down scientists try to dress up for these YouTube videos. They put a sport coat over a t-shirt and jeans.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think he says some really interesting things. I mean, I remember one of the things that Albert said was that if my paper has 2 or more equations in it, I send it to a science journal. If it has less than 2, I send it to a philosophy journal, which I thought was really interesting. And it's something that we've talked about, we pointed out a lot, that popularizers of science have essentially eschewed mathematics totally. There is no mathematics in popularizers of science. So I thought that was a good illustration. And he also said something very interesting in his books. I don't think it was in this YouTube discussion here, but he said that I think that the fields are most healthy when you aren't worrying about the boundaries between them. If there's just a robust discussion going on and you aren't worrying too much about whether you're breaking boundaries, you're actually learning things and not being so concerned about the barriers between you. And I think a lot of that has to do with politics of budgets and things within universities. That gets way down into the, that gets way down into the weeds of academic life. You're going to get a new professorship in your department and all that sort of thing. But I think that pointed out a really interesting thing, that the arguments about fields and the boundaries between fields are actually a sign of a weakness of the fields as opposed to a strength, which I thought was very interesting.
Great point.
Observation.
When you attack and say that philosophy is dead, what you're saying is like, look, where are your boundaries? Where are our boundaries? And like, it seems that you're a proper subset of science, so we don't need you anymore. Proper subset being that
Right.
you're completely contained within the purview of science. Everything that you're asking, we can answer. We don't need you anymore. You're talking about boundaries essentially, right? You're saying take a look from above and see sort of like, the questions that you're asking and the questions that we're asking, and see that there isn't anything that you're asking that we can't answer. So
why do we need you?
Well, why do we need you, right? So you're attacking the boundaries, and that certainly, that's not productive, and I think it hurts the scientific. You want to sort of be inclusive. You want to sort of get multiple points of view, right? That will help inform your science. So remember last week I presented an anthropic principle, right? A new anthropic principle. When we were talking about it, about how consciousness necessarily follows from the constants of nature being as they are. Remember the fine tuning, right? That the constants of nature is so finely tuned that consciousness had to arise from its being finely tuned. That's the strong anthropic principle. The weak anthropic principle quickly being that, well, yes, there are infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be on the one. Like, we just happen to be on one that consciousness could arise in naturally. If you are awake because you just happen to be by chance on the one that conditions were just right. But there's nothing magical about it. You just happen to be in the one that is. But now there's this new anthropic principle. Remember, so consciousness necessarily follows from the constants of nature being as they are. But the more we uncover about nature and how finely tuned it is, the harder it will be to build simulations where the conditions are set as is known at the present time, without consciousness arising at some point in the simulation. So remember that your simulation, right? What we do is we throw a bunch of inputs and boundary conditions as we're aware of them in the universe. We put it into the algorithm, and we hit enter and let the algorithm run and see how that universe or simulated universe evolves. We can sort of see, the simulation looks very similar to our universe. So there's something right about the conditions that we put into that simulation. So that's the only way that you would get such a correspondence. This anthropic principle, which I've dubbed the rare anthropic principle. So you have the weak, the strong, and the rare anthropic principle. It's rare because of how empty simulations are of substance, but it's anthropic because we grant whatever consciousness is, it is not reducible in terms of the simulation. Consciousness sort of comes out. The more that you know about the universe, right, the more that you have to input into that simulation to get it to look like the universe that we see, the harder and harder it becomes for that simulation not to produce simulated beings, simulated conscious beings, essentially. It's kind of like the rare anthropic principle is it's like the strong anthropic principle, but with more of a meaty sort of explanation, or something that we can actually test. That being, the further we go in time, the more we know, the more data that we collect about our universe, the more that we have to include in this program that we're running, simulation that we're running, to match our universe with the simulation, the less likely it will be that the simulation not have a conscious being sort of pop out of existence. So it's like the constants of nature need to be as they are for consciousness to have arisen. It's for consciousness to arise. This is evidence, and the more that we understand about nature, like the more finely tuned we understand that nature is, the better sense we have that this universe was designed for consciousness to fall out of it. So it gives us a sense that there's meaning to our existence, right? That we're not just some cosmic accident, essentially. But I'd like to sort of hear what scientists sort of have to say about it. Honestly, I haven't tested it. This is just an idea, hypothesis I have. Am I just imagining things, or is it harder and harder to produce a simulation, having introduced all that we know into it, without having a conscious beings come out of it?
Yeah, it's kind of like the stronger anthropic principle.
The stronger.
Stronger.
That might be better.
And also, I like the. I've never heard anybody quite say it's about the necessity within the simulation. as your simulations become more and more complex and more filled with what we actually know about the world, that simulation necessitates the introduction of consciousness. I think that's a unique, that's a unique little presentation.
That's certainly, I think, I've never come across that either. Right, but you see sort of the point here that there's an asymptote here. That is, if we were to know all the constants of nature exactly to the nth decimal place, then it would have to be that consciousness comes out. As the more we know, right, the closer and the harder and harder it becomes for consciousness not to come out.
Ignore consciousness.
If we knew all the constants of nature exactly, then consciousness would come out of all of those simulations.
Well, I think that'd be cool to approach a scientist about that and see whether that is a new way. It sounds new to me relative to, because I looked a lot at anthropic principle for quite a while.
Yeah,
I've talked to one of your physicists. Great.
What we got for this week?
Yeah, that's good. So next week, I'll give you a little bit of a writing, and we'll think about how to approach Nietzsche and Sartre next week.
Oh, I look forward to it. Yeah. All right.
Take care.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Okay, you too.
Entering the Universe has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. Until next time. No.